Hey, as therapists, we all know the importance of use of space, of making sure that the environments that we abide in or that we surround ourselves in speak to our values and our mental health. And sometimes this is a difficult thing to translate to our clients, especially the clients who are struggling with anxiety and depression. We know that if we struggle with mental health challenges or chronic pain, fatigue is a factor, low motivation is a factor, becoming easily overwhelmed is a factor. And so, despite the importance, it's a challenge sometimes to find out how we can get a stronghold or a foothold on our use of space. Or, as systems theorists, therapists, we know that person and environment is a key factor. So, how we engage clients in finding meaningful and actionable ways to take charge of their space in ways that are meaningful and valuable to them can be a definite challenge. And that's why I'm excited to have our special guest on today, Holly Allison, who is an expert on decluttering. And she's had her own personal challenges with clutter and other personal hurdles. And she's going to talk to us about how she's managed to work through many of those hurdles and how we can do the same. So without further ado, let's meet Holly. Hey, Holly, how you doing?
Hi, Patrick. Thanks for having me on, and so kind of you to call me an expert.
Yeah, sure. I
so,
mean, you're more than I do, that's for sure. You're living it.
so
So thanks
yeah.
for yeah, thanks for being on. You want to share a little bit about your background and how you came into this space of decluttering? It's definitely a
Sure.
thorn in the side for I think everyone to some extent. I don't think we ever get used to or fully adept at manager space. I feel like it's always a constant
Mhm.
challenge of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So maybe you could share with us a little bit how you got into this space and why.
For sure. So, like anyone else, and my mom's going to be the first one that say that, like, I've always been a cluttery person. As a child, it just chaos everywhere. And it wasn't until late in 2020, I moved from a one bedroom apartment into a four bedroom, two bath house all by myself. And even though I thought I got rid of a lot of stuff, by the time the truck was unloaded, I went, where did all this stuff come and how are four bedrooms almost nearly full already? And it was sickening.
Mm.
So, of course, I'm relaying this to a friend on the phone. And we know our phones listen to us. And so YouTube starts pushing out the minimal mom. And I was like, huh, what is this like minimalism and decluttering? And gosh, like she's right. Like no one teaches us how to manage like consumerism or all the things that we think that we need to keep. So I went down that path. I went minimalist, and we can get into a little bit of this later. But I definitely fell off the wagon, and now I'm back at it again.
I think of decluttering a lot like weight loss. You know, it's easy to
hmm
get gung ho about anything for a while, but sustaining is hard. Why do you think it's hard to sustain things, even if they're important to us, even if they're things that we know if we stay on top of, we're going to feel better about ourselves and our space? Like, why is it so hard to stick with something like maintaining our space?
So personally, I've felt like a lot of it stems from it's kind of a double-edged sword. Some of it is like you get to this point where you really enjoy where you're at, and I have been in that space of like, wow, I'm really fit and great, and then you get a little bit complacent, like, oh, I can do that tomorrow or the next day, and then some of these external factors in our lives start creeping up more and more because we're letting some of that other stuff slide. And for me, if I was placing more value or having other external factors kind of, I don't want to say push me down, but if I started feeling those feelings of like, oh, this is kind of crappy, well, my self-care is I'm going to skip this today because, that's what my body and my mind needs. And then it's just a slippery slope from there, I feel
Mhm.
like.
That's such a good point. I think this is true with anything fitness, any goals really that require
hmm
our fortitude. Is where do we give ourselves grace
hmm
and when does it become complacent? Or
Yep.
what's self compassion and what is avoidance, more specifically?
Yes. Yes.
How do we walk that rope?
Boy, I've been struggling with this. I've often been an all or nothing person, whether it's fitness, whether it's I love my job, I hate my job. I love having this nice, tidy, nearly empty home to, oh gosh, I don't want to have to keep maintaining. Like, it's really been a struggle. And I would say recently it's been much more manageable to find this middle ground where, it is just the balance in managing everything. So for me, what has been absolutely crucial is and I've learned this from others in the decluttering space, called 5 minutes matters. And at first I was like, does it really though? And I did this with my audience. I put a camera on it and I was like, I'm not going to see a difference. But let's play along with this. And I did that one and I compared footage and I went, oh my gosh, that's all I really need to do is put in 5 minutes of effort for this kind of output, because our expectation of what we're going to get done in that 5 minutes is so low. Like, the bar is down here, like, I'm not going to get much done, but you have 5 minutes. So you're trying to like get the most out of it. So even though you don't think it's going to meet here in the middle. So I think that's really been a critical learning.
That's a really good point, because I feel like it's easy to underestimate what can be done in a short period of time and overestimate what we think is going to be easy. And I've definitely found this to be the case in different domains of life, school being one, and college. And I've always kind of been this way, but I'm the kind of guy who would rather stay up all night and finish the report in one like painful swoop than kind of pick away at it. And I know it's important to be able to do both, but I don't know if it's the way I'm wired, or other people are wired that way. But I'm like, all or nothing, and I think that's a common hurdle. And and this is true with everything. Like, especially if you're planning your day. Like, and these days, I really like to plan my days as best I can, or the white spaces on the calendar, and kind of set an agenda. But my house list keeps growing. It's like the last thing on the list.
Yep.
And we've had these, the bane of my existence has been our garage and getting that thing organized. And one of the big hurdles is the bicycles, right? So we've, gone back and forth, and we finally ordered some like rolling bike racks, and they've been sitting outside for probably weeks. And so I finally decided, okay, today's the day. So yesterday I'm going to unbox them. And this is going to take me like 4 hours in my head, right? Because I'm not a mechanical guy. I'm the one who has to put things together like 3 times and take it apart before I figure it out, right? Unless there's a YouTube video or something. So and I was pleasantly surprised at how quickly they were put together. So what I thought was going to take 4 hours took maybe 5 minutes for one. In 15 minutes I had the bikes up, and it's already, within one day, like providing quality back to my life, because now I'm not like stumbling over the bikes in the garage just to get to what I need to get to. I can just roll them out of the way. And it's those small things, to your point. Like, oftentimes we build things up in our head thinking they're going to take longer, rather than just trying and seeing. Like, oh, if I let me spend 5 minutes on this and see how far I get, maybe I'm right. Maybe it's just too much to bite off, but might be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I think that's often the case. And I actually have a video that just keeps kind of getting pushed on the back burner for editing. And I think what happens is, because I had this thing in my, so I'm building this momentum and things are going faster and faster and getting easier. And then I'm like, okay, so then I'm going to do this video and I'm going to show how easy it is. And then I hit every roadblock. I didn't have the right hardware. So then I have to stop. And then the next day I'm going out and like, this had turned out to be like a 3 or 4 day project. So when you start hitting all those hurdles, that's the only time our brain remembers. We don't remember the times where, it was the simple thing that went together, in 15, 20, 30 minutes. We remember those times where I'm like, but it's such a production, and I don't have it in me. So I thought that was really interesting to get that contrast.
Kind of that way with everything, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
We tend to gravitate toward the difficult things, the things that give us resistance, the things we're unhappy with, not the things that go well. Right. Not the
I would
things
agree
that
with
were
that.
not our wins for the day. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
how do you conjure those memories up? How do you remind yourself that, hey, not everything is always hard, harder than it could be?
As I say, it's actually kind of a difficult thing
Hmm.
to kind of retrain yourself. And this actually happened somewhat recently. So for those of you who don't know, I'm on my lunch break. So I recently got my performance review, and by anybody else looking at this performance review would be like, "This is glowing," and I look at this one thing and I'm like, "Really?" Like, and I'm stewing for the day, and oh man. I wish I would have thought to bring in this book. I think it's called Managing Your Emotions.
Hmm.
And this is something I learned, especially when I quit drinking, is it's okay to sit in that emotion, feel it, but don't let it, I know it's hard to say don't let it color your whole day, but like give that feeling its due time and go, you know what, this feels crappy. And then you're like, all right, am I done feeling crappy now? I don't want to feel crappy anymore. Let's move on. And so now I'm like, all right, it was a review. It happened. And that thing that was, I knew it was likely to come up on my review. Like, oh, one thing didn't go so well. So just let it go.
Yeah, it's kind of like that saying: we can get bitter,
Mm-hmm.
or we can be better.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it sounds
Mm-hmm.
like a cliche, but it's true. And in the therapy world, we talk about things called harmful thinking habits. For somebody with anxiety, it might be catastrophizing, or what we know as the worst
Mm-hmm.
case scenario, right? But what you just described is negative filtering. It's when we
Mm-hmm.
we can only see the negative and we blow it out of proportion. We make mountains out of molehills instead of
Mm-hmm.
looking at the positive, right? Or
Yep.
reframing. Like everybody, especially unless they've have 20 years under their belt, at a company, are going to have some critical feedback. If for no
Mm-hmm.
other reason, they can't give everybody 100, 5 stars all the
Exactly.
time, right? It's just it's part of the politics, right, of jobs. So I think how we
Mm-hmm.
frame things is very important, but being aware, having that self-awareness to know what's going on and be like, oh wait, am I tunneling? Am I negative filtering? Like, what am I doing here that I feel this way? Let me take a step back and look at the situation objectively as best I can.
Mm-hmm.
That's a hard thing to do, right? In the moment, like you said.
Yeah. And it's especially hard sometimes, I feel like, in the past. I mean, this is how I was an ex-smoker, and actually that I had quit years and years ago, and I think that was more of a product of my environment sort of a thing. But
Mhm.
drinking really crept up because I'm like, but for the most part when I drink I feel better, but you're not really feeling better because then you just feel like garbage the next day, and then you're still like, oh, this still like you're still mulling over this thing because you didn't give it its due time to sit with it. And it's really uncomfortable at first to start sitting in those negative emotions, but it doesn't define us. You go, okay, this feels like crap. What is this negative emotion telling me? Do I
Mhm.
need to fix something? Is it just like, okay, I learned something and move on? Like, what can I actually do? And if there's nothing to do, well, then just let it move on. Is this going to color what's going on in 5 years from now, or can I let it go?
Yeah, great point, Holly. And
Mm-hmm.
Hang on, Princess asks if we can explain
Mm-hmm.
tunneling a bit more. Absolutely, and congratulations on working on that shelf. Thing on Princess. That's
Yeah.
that's me. I'm the one that'll mess it up before I get it right, and that's okay.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
what
Mm-hmm.
wood putty is for, and paint. So we'll be okay. um, yeah. So tunneling. I think of tunneling as just when we get hyper focused on any one thing, and it has to do with reflected appraisals, right? Negative reflected appraisals. When we assume what other people are thinking about us and that they are judging us. And this is very common with
Mm-hmm.
anxiety. It's very common with people pleasers. It's very common with if you look at attachment styles, anxious avoidant attachment styles. When you are very sensitive to other people's opinions of you, and we have to be careful that we don't make other people our absolute mirrors of our self-worth, because when we do that, we will become hyper focused on small things. It's one thing to be self-critical, it's another to give your value in its entirety to other people's opinions.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if by tunneling, I mean if we don't give ourselves a chance to digest something with perspective and objectivity, then, like Holly said, we will allow it to take root and take up space in our minds, that it'll carry over to the next day, or it will distract us from other things that are important. And this is where that self-fulfilling prophecy really comes in. If we allow ourselves to get tripped up by one criticism, or even if it's a self-criticism, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing that, we start shitting on ourselves, or I can't believe
Mm-hmm.
it, I did that, that's all they're going to think about me now. Then what happens is we can't be present. We can't be present with the other things we need to be focused on, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's as a parent, um, whether that's other tasks that we've set aside for ourselves. And then what happens is we end up dropping the ball in those other things, which then only further impact our self opinion, self image, right? Negative self talk. And so that's why tunneling is so dangerous, is because it
Mm-hmm.
takes our head out of the game, and it takes us away from being present. And this is very akin to anxiety, right? A lot of what we talk about when we talk about hoarding or clutter, a lot of it has to do with an anxious mindset. And when you're anxious, you have a foot in the future and a foot in the past, because you're future tripping and you're shaming yourself from the past, and you can't really be present. So I hope that explains. That's just a term I throw around, tunneling, because it's kind of tunnel vision on things that maybe we're giving too much weight. Some things deserve that kind of attention if it's urgent,
Mm-hmm.
if it's a crisis, if it's important and urgent, right? Think about Stephen Covey's, matrix for prioritizing. But most things don't require that level of urgent, like obsession, right? Normally it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, noted, I'll work on that, turn my attention back to the other things. But as soon as we allow it to take root, it's going to zap us of our emotional or mental energy. And other things are going to suffer as a result, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting that you bring that up, and I'm actually curious to hear what you would have to say about this, because I don't think this is an uncommon phenomenon where you lay down in bed and then you remember something from, I don't know, high school, middle school, like, I can't believe I did or said that, and we're just ruminating over something that the other person who's no longer in our life, number
Mm-hmm.
one, and also probably has long forgotten it. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on why, as a human species, we tend to randomly have these, like, oh man, like, geez, I can't believe I did that.
Yeah, because we care. And I think this goes back to our
Mm.
tribal mentality in our DNA. We want to be accepted by the tribe.
Sure.
And if we don't feel like we're accepted by the tribe, then we're at risk. People's opinions
Mm.
literally mattered for our survival at one point. And
Mm-hmm.
not to get too cliche with the whole tribal thing, but I think that's true. And we all have different levels of acceptance within
Mm-hmm.
our inner circles, outer circles, and society as a whole. But also because of how we appraise ourselves. We appraise ourselves often by other people's opinions of us. And so this is why it's so important to be able to laugh at ourselves, right? To not take
Mm-hmm.
ourselves so seriously. And this is especially true when we're looking at things like social anxiety. And if we want to go deeper with that, a lot of it goes down to our core beliefs about ourselves, which are formed by our early childhood experiences, oftentimes by our caregivers and how they spoke to us. And even though we might be adults, we oftentimes have to reparent ourselves and how we speak to ourselves. And so, if we're going to get really, into the therapy side of things, that's what, therapy and counseling really works on. It's understanding that, first of all, what a thought is. A thought is a fact, not a fact. A thought is either a statement or a question to ourselves, a statement or a question, and that facts aren't feelings. So that also means we have to understand the difference between thoughts and feelings and talking about them differently. And because once we get a handle on that, then we'll be able to better address the self-talk. Does that make sense? Meaning not
Mm-hmm.
every thought is valid, not every thought gets a green light in terms of an absolute truth. And that's why
Interesting.
the labeling is important. When I say self-talk, like Klingon Princess just talked about, making a mistake at this game at a family dinner, and all morning figured everyone thinks I'm an idiot, right?
Mm-hmm.
This has to do with the amount of importance you're giving to the activity, right? And this is true in any unfamiliar environment. We're going to be hypersensitive to how we're being perceived because we feel like we have to prove ourselves in some way. So this family dinner could have been, the family you haven't seen in a while, could have been around people that maybe you felt a little more under the microscope with, and so you're already on guard,
Mm-hmm.
right? So just food for thought. Try not to make something more than what it is. Oh man, I haven't played this game in so long. I always make this mistake when I play. Man, you know, I'm gonna learn from y'all. And so finding
Yeah.
ways to lighten up the conversation, or even out yourself, if you have a worry, and this is a way you can test if you have a negative thought or assumption, rather than leave it up to assumption and assume the worst. You can either assume the best or you can test, right? And testing would be saying something or doing something to test the kind of feedback you get to see if your opinions are valid or your assumptions. And one way is to make
Mm-hmm.
light of something and see if other people laugh or make light of it too. If they don't, or they criticize you, then you have your answer. But it's rarely the case that people are actually judging you like you think they are.
Right. Right. Yeah. I feel like there's a family member that, somewhat recently I was conveying something, and so then I got oh, well, why did you go with this? And then I said, well, when you get your own, you can do whatever you want and call it, so it was like, so that really kind of diffused the situation a little bit. So, because again, I would have normally taken that very like, geez, can't I do anything right? And I still kind of was feeling that way in the moment, but like, geez, I'm never going to be able to do anything right in the eyes of this person. But, by kind of, I don't want to say deflecting or reflecting, but a little bit like in a joking manner, like, oh, hey, well, when you do it, you can do whatever you want and however
Yeah,
you want.
absolutely. So I think
So,
talking to ourselves
yeah.
oftentimes like we would talk to a child, ideally.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not how
Mm-hmm.
we were talked to as children, but as you would talk to your own child or your own best friend with compassion, right? And understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that we're talking about this because I'm assuming this is a major factor in what gets in the way of managing our space. Is that right, Holly?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Because, we don't go down that immediate spiral, but these little things, that build up over time, especially with people who have shaped us from a family from when we were very young till, into adulthood. And I still very distinctly remember I was on the treadmill one day. This was, probably at my fittest, and I was, really trying to make that effort. And treadmill thinking is like my best thinking, and so I should do more of that. But I had this revelation in my mind of like, I've never felt like I deserved being in this place, and and that's reflected in my home too. But like even recently, where I'm like, well, the people around me feel like I don't deserve these things, and eventually it starts to color how we actually manage our homes or don't manage our homes for that matter. And that's probably the one thing that is the hardest thought and emotion to reprogram, is that feeling of deserving. And I still struggle with it now, but it's like, all right, I can just do what I can do. And again, if I put a timer on for 5 minutes, set a reminder on my phone, maybe, do I always do a 5-minute task every day? No, but it reminds me more often than not than going down a Netflix spiral or go, oh, well, yeah, there's a commercial break. I'm getting kind of sick of the show anyway. Let me go ahead and do something for 5 minutes. It just takes a little bit of some of that pressure off too. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a term for that. I just can't remember it. If you guys remember the term for that, it's a something principle.
Mm-hmm.
Starts with the P, I think. But I don't want to slaughter it. So, hey, thanks, Susan. Glad you're here.
Yeah.
For joining us. Yeah, there's a term for that, about setting timers for specific tasks, and whether we get that task quote completed or not, we just set the timer, and then that's it. That's how much time we allocate to it, right? Which is a little bit different than Parkinson's law. Parkinson's law states that a task takes as much time as we give it, which
Mm-hmm.
means like if we give ourselves a week to do something that would probably take 2 days, it'll take a week.
Yep.
And so it's just how our brains function. And so the whole idea of, but if we get overwhelmed easily, or we sometimes struggle with squirrel brain, and we have trouble staying on task for one thing with that, and then everything else kind of falls by the wayside, meaning like to avoid, I think you had termed it decision fatigue. That's maybe one thing we can do is we can set
Mm-hmm.
timers to so that we don't neglect other things that need attending to. And this is a strategy I really like, because just because you move on from one subject to another does not mean that you don't get to circle back if you have time,
Yep.
right? If you have a sink full of dishes, 10 loads of laundry to do, a car to clean out, kids to pick up, and I don't know, a lawn to mow, right? You probably can't do all of those in the same 2-hour period, but you might be able to touch and go, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I know this is probably dependent on anyone's given financial situation, but I've gotten to the point where I'm like, man, if the kid 2 houses down wants to make a couple blocks off of mowing the lawn and that gives me back 45 minutes of the day, I've just gotten to that point. Like, and it doesn't mean I don't enjoy mowing the lawn. It's fun to just ride around when there's no traffic on my lawn. So
Yeah.
I just get to ride around and get to enjoy peace. But like lately I'm like, you know what? It's one thing I can take off my plate. That's an easy thing to outsource. So
Yes.
yeah.
That's important. I think that's huge, and that's an even deeper discussion, is knowing ourselves well enough to know when are we at our best, and what tasks do we ideally want to accomplish, and then what are we okay with rolling over, and what can we outsource, right?
Yep.
I don't mind mowing the lawn, but sometimes it's nice to outsource that.
Right. Or,
Sometimes it feels good to
oh
mow the lawn,
geez, the last, yeah. Or, oh geez, the last day without rain, I have plans. Oh, all right, here's, 20, $30. Go ahead and have at it.
Yeah. Hey, Raja, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. And I think when you read self-help books, there's a term for that. It's called eat the frog. It's doing the hardest thing first. It's a funny term. I think it's supposed to be funny. So
Yeah.
I remember, but I think in other books like Entree Leadership by Dave Ramsey and stuff, they call it day one, right? But in terms of prioritizing the harder things first, theoretically, because you'll have more bandwidth at the beginning. When I'm working with clients with anxiety and like specifically depression, so you never know how much gas you're gonna have in your tank when you wake up, right? So the day starts the night before. So have some ideas about how you want your day to go. Write them down, but then when you wake up in the morning, ask yourself, what do I need to shift based on how I feel right now? And maybe get out of bed first. Have some coffee. But give yourself a grace to shift things and allow things to roll over, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting because Eat the Frog is kind of a popular thing in the decluttering space. And, it's funny because I was still the person, and I still kind of am, that like, okay, just for example, let's just pretend it's April and I have to do my taxes. And I'm like, man, I should do that first. But boy, I will get absolutely nothing done and still not do it because I just, gotta find my W-2 and I gotta find this paperwork and I gotta find that. And again, I know like it's building this up in my mind of this is going to be way worse than what it's actually going to be. But also from Dave Ramsey was, if you look at his other books, like The Money Makeover, I think is the one that I have, and there's a couple other ones where he does snowball effect. So what's my little win to give me a little bit of boost of confidence and keep riding that wave and that trajectory? And I think that's been probably another really powerful thing for like doing 5-minute chunks of either decluttering or housework is, okay, the timer goes off and you're done, but I'm still kind of like low-key scanning for things, or it becomes easier to go, oh, here's a piece of something that goes in the trash. I'm just going to grab that on my way to the trash bag. Like it's really a little, in my mind, been key to continuing that momentum and coming up with more things, even if you only intended to do 5 minutes, or you felt like that 5 minutes was a struggle.
Absolutely, and I think Klingon Princess just echoed that. She said that definitely sometimes, there's a time to eat the frog, right? And there's a time
Mm-hmm.
for the small wins, like you said, the snowball. And I think it's important that we don't get too hung up on absolutes.
Yeah.
You know, we all need small wins. We need small wins to stay motivated. And this is if you ever read James Clear's book Atomic Habits, I
Mm-hmm.
love that book. It's like one of my
Yes.
favorite reason it's a bestseller. But he talks about something called habit stacking. And I think this has to do more with inertia, right? A body in motion
Mm-hmm.
tends to stay in motion. A body at rest tends to stay at rest. And one of the easiest things to do is talk ourselves out of doing what we really want to be doing. And if you look at,
Mm-hmm.
the Stoics and Stoicism, they talk about value, a virtuous life. And really that just has to do with when we live in alignment with the things that are important to us and we do what we tell ourselves that we're going to do, we tend to feel better and happier about our lives. So then it becomes this balance of not overcommitting to ourselves, but also not talking ourselves out of the doable things that really aren't as hard as we make them in our head once we start trying to negotiate.
Absolutely. Oh, man. And that's the other thing, too, that was really interesting. So, keeping that in the same vein of we were talking earlier about, a task is going to take as much time as you give it. And there was a spare room in particular that became quite a series of I'm just going to do 5 minutes at a time, see how this stacks up. And in the past, and I've spoken about this a few times, in the past, I would have said, I need to set aside a whole week and it's going to take all day. And it's going to take all day because we give it that time. And it's also going to take all day because of some of that decision fatigue and then, making mistakes or wait, do I need this? Does this go in the maybe box? And, getting all out of sorts. But when I put that little 5 minute chunk time on it, it ended up being, I think, 37 minutes total is what it took to completely clear out that room. And I'm like, wow. But if I would have said I'm going to put 35 minutes on the timer, I would have gotten nowhere near as much done.
That's true, right? And I think too,
So
when we get moving on something, we
mm-hmm.
tend to stick with it, like you said. Like it's like, okay, if I can commit to 5 minutes of whether that's exercise or cleaning or writing a school report, whatever it is, as a therapist is doing therapy notes. It's like, but once you get started, it's like, okay, it's not so bad. But I think once we get into that mindset and into that mode, we're more likely to stick with it for a while. But this also speaks to something else that I found really important that I don't think we talk enough about, and that is improving the moment. A lot of us do this subconsciously, right? Or just habitually. We'll turn on music or we're doing the dishes or something. And this is also, I think, important to use forethought. It's like, oh, I committed to doing this thing, or I have to do this thing. How can I make this thing more enjoyable? Can I bookend it with other enjoyable activities? Can I do anything while I'm doing that I find more enjoyable? For me, it's listening to podcasts. If I'm gardening, if I'm mowing the lawn, if I'm not with family, if I'm doing solo, then I'm either listening to something I enjoy or I'm educating myself with something, an audiobook or something. For me, that makes the time fly by because it's not like I'm just gardening. I'm also reading a book.
Right.
My wheels are turning. And like you said, when I'm doing those things, I'm actually in more of an alpha state. If I make it more enjoyable. So then actually that brings on other ideas, which then lends itself to more sense of motivation, if you were. So, yeah.
Interesting. It's something I do inherently often is I'm going to do the dishes or, get set for the week. And obviously I can't really sit in front of the TV and effectively do those things. So I just throw on one of the music streaming services. But the other thing I started doing is if I start finding myself getting a little hyper fixated on, say, a crochet or knitting project or something that's a little bit more of a hobby and also a way that we can use as avoidance sometimes. I've started negotiating with myself. I'm like, okay, if I just do some dishes, then I can go sit down for, an hour or something. So that's something I've found helpful as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, rewarding ourselves within reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Very good. So, when it comes to specific tactics, what have you found to be, or what advice would you give to someone who's feeling overwhelmed? Maybe it's not just one thing, maybe it's they just feel overwhelmed because all of their spaces, like they don't know where to start. Like, how do you know where to start when it comes to decluttering?
How do you start? Wow. And this I was borrowing from a lot of my audience has heard of Dana K. White. She has a book called Decluttering at the Speed of Life, not light. So, and her first layer of decluttering is start with stuff that's just obviously trash. Well, that's pretty low investment. Like, oh, there's a wrapper here. Oh, this is almost empty. I might as well just throw it away. The next step is going to be what she calls declutter, where it's like, oh, why was I hanging on to this broken thing? Let me get rid of it. Or, this belongs in another, you're right, this belongs in another room. Let me go take it there now. I don't know why I set this down in here. So, and it's kind of going down, starting from the easiest things and then going all the way down to the sentimental things is usually the last thing. And I've noticed that's also pretty consistent with like Marie Kondo. Her method of decluttering is sentimental items are last, because you have to kind of build that decluttering muscle or a new lens. And I even found this out myself when I first went through my decluttering back in early 2021, by the time I'd completed it at that point. And that's another interesting thing, because we don't need to complete things, and that's where we get complacent. But so I got to this point where I'm doing sentimental stuff, and I'm going through these school things that you think you're supposed to keep. I need to keep this awards program. I need to and it's taking up space and bandwidth. And I remember by the time I came across it, I'm 42 years old, which means I've been keeping this stuff for 24 years. Normally I would have been like, oh, I need to keep this. But when I picked it up, I didn't remember fondly the 2 awards that I had gotten. What I remembered was the one award that I really thought I was going to get, and being really upset that I didn't get it. And I went, well, then I don't need a reminder of this in my home. And it went in the trash. So I think that really helped by saving some of those things for last, of like, was this really a positive thing that I want a reminder of? Not necessarily. So
that's an important perspective. I haven't really heard of that put that way before, but even positive things can be a trigger that we hold on to, right?
Yeah.
And also what value they add. Like, we hang on to it just because it's a memory, but that having a clean or decluttered space would provide more quality towards it. There's something to be said for that too.
Right. Or is this the thing that I'm going to look at when I want to remember this time period in my life? Not necessarily. I can just have that memory when I want it. So I still think there's a time and a place for sentimental things, obviously. But it really helps you to decide what's really important. And I've heard this said a few different ways, but what are the things that I'm going to knock on some faux wood right in front of me. God forbid. If there was a flood. So for those who might have a basement. So if something got ruined in water, what would be the things that you'd be upset by that you feel are shelf worthy now? Now, do you need the things on the bottom that might have gotten ruined? Or, unfortunately, about a month or 2 ago, we had a fire in the neighborhood, lost everything. And, it's like, what are the things at the end of the day that you would actually be upset at and wish that you would have been able to grab out in one of those situations?
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Now, obviously, you can't keep everything in that.
Right?
Yep.
There's an apocalypse, or zombie apocalypse. What's going on? Absolutely.
Sure.
I'm a big fan too of, we live in a digital age, and if it doesn't have to be a
Mhm.
tactile thing, we can scan it into some place where we can have quick access to it later. You know.
That's actually interesting that you brought this up because I was looking back at some comments, and one of the questions or challenges that was brought up is that this person felt like they were micromanaging the process and wanting to document everything that they were getting rid of, decluttering, donating, whatever the case is, and they were letting that get in the way of actually getting things out of the house. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on letting that I need to micromanage this and have this be the most perfect way to let go of things.
I think it really, again, I think it depends on, like, some people are more attached to physical things.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are better with something like a reflection of it. Like, I'm for the most part okay with a reflection of things, but some people who really want that tangible, original thing, I think
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't even have to be it doesn't have to stay in your garage. It doesn't have to stay in your
Mm-hmm.
closet. I think if some things are that worthy of holding on to, maybe if it's within your budget, it might be for your own mental health to get a small storage.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere where you can put things that are most meaningful versus the things you can let go of. I don't know. That's just a thought. I haven't done that myself yet.
Right,
But,
right, yeah.
I
Interesting.
have a hard time with the idea of paying for extra storage, but at what cost?
Right.
If the clutter is costing you on your day-to-day sanity, but you're not yet ready to let go of some things, maybe it's time to move
Mm-hmm.
into another location. Maybe eventually the financial cost will be enough of a motivation for you to start letting go. I don't know.
Fair, fair. And that's actually interesting that you bring that up because my audience knows that I have, I don't want to say railed against minimalism, but I've started and because I feel like a lot of my friends now on YouTube are saying, oh gosh, I tried minimalism too and I failed, and geez, what was wrong with me? And I'm like, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to get down to a single bowl and a spoon and 3 pieces of clothing in our closet. It's like, know yourself and what you're comfortable with keeping. But then it's almost like, okay, but then trying to find the balance of like, okay, but what if I have this storage space? Is that going to compel me to hoard some more, or is it just giving me breathing room in my space? So I think it really is a personal choice in that matter.
Absolutely. And when I think of, rather than minimalism, I think of functional.
Mm-hmm.
Is my space functional? In terms of also what speaks to you as a person. Because for someone to feel like they're in their zone, some things have an intrinsic value to them that help them cultivate a mental state or identity that makes the space more functional for them, right? And so if you're a very
Absolutely.
eccentric person, you might have certain things. I don't know. I think was it Johnny Depp's house? I don't know. Something I saw. It kind of looked very busy, but you could tell it was very
Mm-hmm.
in tow with his personality,
Mm-hmm.
right? In terms of everything around him had some significant meaning, but also spoke to probably his mental creative space,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think
And
it's very intentional.
I've used this term as it relates to my bookcase in particular because I decided I didn't want it to be stuffed end to end with books, and then I would start putting books this way, and I was like, why am I doing this? And I was like, you know what? My bookcase, I'm curating. And so that was the word I was using for myself. I am curating what is the collection that I want to have on display in my bookcase, whether it's books in a combination of a few decorative items, or is it all books? And I really pared it down to probably a shelf and a half, but now I have it spread out, and then I have a few decorative items that I felt like I wanted to put on display. And I think that was really like, okay, what's display worthy in my mind? And I think that's probably how Johnny Depp feels, is like, no, these are things that he feels speaks to him and that he wants to display that reflects him I think what's the word, artifacts that he
Yeah,
would want to put on display.
absolutely.
So,
So it's a very nuanced, right? This whole
mhm.
idea of decluttering. It's not just about cleaning your space. It's not just about
Hmm.
being a minimalist. It's about your personality, what speaks to you, your
Hmm.
values, and then what's reasonable, and then what's doable within a certain,
Hmm.
certain amount of time. And so this is a same reason that finance is difficult, because that's why it's called personal finance. It's not just the math. Everybody can figure out the math.
Yeah.
It's all of the surrounding values that go behind the math, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. Or if it's,
Yep.
plan for the future. So it's nuanced, just like fitness, right?
Hmm.
We all know how to be in
Yeah.
shape, but there's different psychological aspects and personal aspects and values that go behind the behavior that we do and the choices we make. And this is, I think, with anything, we're not just talking about a linear decision to declutter. We're talking about competing goals, right?
Hmm.
Competing goals mean we all have 24 hours in a day. We all have different
Yep.
commitments. We all have different responsibilities. We all have different interests. And all of those things compete with each other. And so this
Hmm.
idea of absolute, thinking about something like finance or fitness or decluttering as a single kind of vertical, we don't live in a single vertical. We have to choose and where we invest our time, and think about what kind of return we're going to get on any, right? And
Hmm.
usually can't just slam on the brakes completely on another vertical, right?
Yeah.
We have to kind of wind it down a little bit if we have time to invest somewhere else. And so I think projecting really helps about your calendar, and being realistic about what do we have time for?
Hmm.
When are we going to have some downtime? And then what's reasonable? Do we have little, like you said, 5 minutes a day that we can spare to one thing?
Hmm.
Um, are we, where do we have an hour later? And thinking ahead and protecting that time. I think it's always
Yeah.
easier ahead of time, but when the day comes, right, there's something else that's demanding our attention, competing.
Yep.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. It's the intentionality. And I've often said I'm very, very, for the most part, protective of my Sundays. Now, obviously, there's times where I don't want to say it changes. I'm still protective of my Sundays, but there's going to be times where it's Father's Day or Mother's Day. And so I know that's my compromise. I'm still going to spend time with my parents, and okay, I'm going to let go what I can't get done this weekend. So, we had Father's Day and I had a couple of other commitments, graduation parties. So yesterday I get a text, hey, nah, nah. I was like, sorry, nope, I had to cut it off. As tempting as it was, I said, nope, I have too much I want to get done. And some of that, getting done was some built-in relaxation. But
Sure.
yeah, I would agree. It's that intentionality and protecting, knowing when to set up those boundaries.
Yeah. Boundaries for
So,
self-care, right?
mm-hmm,
Boundaries to rest. All of those things are important, and that's why I think it's important to keep some sense of realism, being realistic with our expectations, so that we don't set ourselves up for self-shame, doubt, criticism, and that we don't
mm-hmm,
burnout, right? If you try and
agree.
go, from 0 to 100 and sustain that long term, something's always going to give. If you're not giving yourself
Mm-hmm,
rest, if you're not diversifying your lifestyle, if you get too hyper focused on one thing, and that can be effective in the short term. We can all walk over coals for a short time if we have a big enough why, right?
right, right.
But to live
For sure.
intensely all the time, that's a recipe for burnout for sure. So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
passion, goal pacing,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
man.
building our tolerance, and that's a different topic,
Yes.
and habituation, and how we can build small habits over time they require less energy from us to sustain, to improve upon, right? Anytime we're learning
Mm-hmm,
a new skill, adapting to a new environment, or building a new habit, there's always a we're building our tolerance to that thing, and our awareness, and knowing what to expect, and how it becomes less work over time, so we can commit more to it as we move on, right? All in good time.
absolutely. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's interesting. So we were touching on self-care a little bit, and we think of these classic things like bubble baths and go to get our nails done, or I don't know. There's so many different ways we can talk about self-care. And we had this conversation offline. Is we often overlook self-care in the places of maintaining our home or decluttering, or we do it as a one-time event and then we get complacent and we think, well, we're done. Well, you're never really done. And I've learned that decluttering has been far more powerful as self-care, especially when I've been in these low moments and feeling like, oh, I got a little bit done.
Mhm.
That's been far more effective and far more empowering and long lasting than I'm going to sit 20 minutes in the bubble bath and I'm going to get out and I'm still going to feel guilty that I did nothing. And so they don't need to be mutually exclusive. You can do both things, but by making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, because often we go, oh, well, it'll be there later, or I'll get to it, or who's going to see it. And so when we do have company, then we're scrambling and we're getting our place together for someone else, but we don't do that for ourselves. So I've even caught myself doing that the other day. I was like, okay, well, my dad wants this mini fridge for a small period, so I'm like going nuts, cleaning it out, and I'm like, wow, this looks really nice. And I'm like, I don't even do this stuff for if I just took the time to maintain these things for my own self, how much more valuable is that? And not to say there's, not value in doing stuff for others, but, it's
Absolutely.
really
But it's
interesting.
like that saying, if we're not filling our cup first, we won't be
Hmm.
able to show up as our best selves for others. We
Hmm.
can show up for other people, but then if we're always giving ourselves our last fruits, we're going to be far less happy and we're going to be far less effective in helping others. We want to serve others
Hmm.
from a surplus of energy, right? It's kind of like the golden goose, I don't know if you're familiar.
It's been a while since I've heard the golden goose.
Right? But the golden goose lays
Yeah.
the golden eggs, right? And so if
Hmm.
you kill the golden goose, you have no more golden eggs. And so the idea is that if you're always keeping your cup full, just within reason, in terms of satisfaction, self-care, compassion, even if it's work, even if it's chore like things, decluttering,
Hmm.
and maybe not such fun things, if it still serves our overall well-being, that serves to fill our cup, right? Of,
Hmm.
of self-care. As long as our cup is full, we can serve more people, we can show up better for other people, we can give our best and more, to others, which will have a far more lasting impact than if we burn out and become resentful
Yeah.
because our cup is always empty, right? And then, well, they never do that for me, or how come nobody else, and eventually we burn out,
Yeah.
because
Hmm.
we get bitter, right? And
Right.
so
Right.
we're just exhausted. And so it's sometimes a sensitive thing, and selfishness is not self-care is not selfish. And I would say it's
Correct.
okay to be selfish. We have to be selfish to some extent.
Hmm.
Ultimately, we will anyway, because we have needs that must be met. We
Hmm.
all have to, at
Hmm.
the end of the day, at some point, have to put ourselves first. And either it's going to become out of necessity because we're burning out or things aren't getting done, and we start declining invitations to do other things and social events, and we start shutting out friends because we're so overwhelmed with the things that have piled up for ourselves that we no longer have the capacity to say yes to other people, even logistically.
Yep.
Or we
I
put
would
ourselves
agree.
first in the first place, and then we have a lot more bandwidth to say yes to other things because our home
Hmm.
base is maintained.
I would agree with that. Absolutely. I feel like that was really reflected in March of 2020 when everyone says, oh, you can't do anything for a couple of weeks. And I went, oh, thank God. And then I went, oh, I need to stop over committing and over scheduling. So I think, the silver lining from that time period was that learning of I need to know when to say no, or I'll see if I can make it, but don't count on me kind of a thing. It's easier to take back instead of declining it and go, it's easier to go, oh, you know what? I can make it after all. Are you still on for this thing? Versus it's so much harder, and we've all done it last minute, like, oh, sorry, I can't make it after all. And then you make up some flimsy excuse, or don't make an excuse. You just say, oh, something came up. I can't make it. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So all good points, all good points. Mm-hmm. And wondering if, how much more time do you have? I know you're on your lunch break. 2 more minutes?
Yep, I have about 5 more minutes. Yep.
Okay. Any rapid fire questions that Holly can address before we call it? Going once. Going twice. While we wait on that, I'm just going to go ahead and highlight your YouTube channel for those who aren't familiar.
Sure, thanks.
More about all things decluttering. Definitely not my expertise. I'm working on it. All right. So this is Holly's website, YouTube. If anybody has
and I accidentally created 2 reminders for today.
Yeah. Manageable Living at Manageable Living at YouTube. You have lots of great information here on decluttering. I'm sure if you have any video requests, should be more than happy to take those. And
absolutely.
Stay in the community. Be sure to subscribe to the Mental Health Toolbox and Manageable Living. And if you would like any more follow-up Q&As like this, just let us know. I think this was a fun conversation, and we will definitely be open to doing more of this, right? So
absolutely.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Holly.
You're so welcome.
Pleasure to have you on, and I will hopefully be able to chat with you again online.
Sounds awesome. Thanks so much, Patrick.
My pleasure. You have a great week.
You too.
Okay.